The hall shimmered with golden light, chandeliers dripping like frozen rain above tables dressed in white linen. Laughter rolled across the room, glasses clinked, and music hummed from the corner, weaving a net of celebration. I sat at my table, hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling both joy and the sharp ache of memory. At 68, my life had been a long road of work and sacrifice, and seeing my daughter Emily standing radiant in her lace gown should have been the crown upon all those years of effort. She was the reason I had endured hunger so she could eat, exhaustion so she could rest, loneliness so she could thrive. And here she was, glowing, smiling, dancing among her friends, the living proof that none of my suffering had been in vain. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I had reached a kind of peace. My husband had died decades ago, leaving me to raise Emily alone, but tonight I felt him close. I could almost picture him at my side, proud tears on his cheeks, watching his little girl take her vows. That thought carried me, softening the sting of being alone in the corner while couples filled the floor. I told myself this silence was contentment, that my role now was simply to watch and feel grateful. But peace has a fragile edge, and mine shattered in a single instant. The music softened, the clatter of silverware hushed, and Stephen, my brand new son-in-law, rose with his champagne glass raised high. All attention swung toward him. He was tall, immaculately dressed, his tie knotted with precision, his smile sharp enough to cut. At first I thought he was about to toast Emily, maybe offer a kind word to me as her mother. Instead, he cleared his throat, glanced across the hall with a gleam of arrogance, and in a voice that carried to every corner he said, "Now your mother is nothing more than a servant in our house." The words sliced the air. Silence fell so suddenly that I could hear the faint rattle of my glass against the table. Gasps broke from the crowd like small explosions, and then came the whispers, threads of shock weaving together into a net that seemed to close around me. My chest tightened as if all the oxygen had been pulled from the room. Emily's smile faltered. I saw her eyes dart from Stephen to me, wide and uncertain, like a child caught between two storms. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but no words came. And the moment stretched unbearable, leaving me exposed beneath the weight of hundreds of eyes. I did not move. I did not speak. My body stiffened as though rooted to the chair, every nerve burning under the humiliation. Servant. That was the word he had chosen. The word he flung like a stone in front of everyone I knew. Servant, after all I had given, after all I had lost. I had scrubbed other people's floors to buy Emily school shoes, taken night shifts in a factory to pay her college tuition, walked home in the rain so she could have bus fare. And now, in one casual sentence, this man reduced me to a caricature, a relic to be mocked, an old woman with no place but the kitchen. The laughter that had once filled the room had curdled into a silence so sharp it felt like judgment. Guests looked at me with pity disguised as curiosity. Some leaned closer to whisper into their neighbors' ears. Others avoided my gaze entirely, as if my shame might be contagious. My relatives shifted uncomfortably, their faces masks of embarrassment. I felt heat rise to my face, a flush not of bashfulness but of humiliation so deep it settled into my bones. My hands trembled in my lap, but I pressed them together tightly, forcing stillness. I would not let them see me break. Stephen lowered his glass, smirk still intact, as though he had scored a private victory. His eyes swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. That silence was his triumph. And yet, in that same silence, something stirred in me, something older, stronger, sharper than tears. I thought of Emily's childhood, the nights she had lain feverish while I sat awake with a damp cloth, whispering promises that everything would be all right. I thought of the mornings I had walked past bakery windows, hungry, but spent my last coins on her breakfast instead. I thought of her first graduation, when I had stood in the crowd with worn shoes, but a heart so full it felt like sunlight. Every sacrifice, every drop of blood and sweat, every humiliation I had endured had been for her. And this was the man she had chosen to call her husband. This was the man who now claimed power over me, who thought he could rewrite my worth in a single sentence. The sting of his words cut deep, but beneath the pain, something else took root. A seed of resolve. I did not yet know what form it would take, but I knew I would not let this moment define me. I might have been silent as the hall gawked, but silence did not mean surrender. My eyes lifted and met Stephen's across the room. He expected to see shame, defeat, perhaps tears. Instead, I gave him a look he did not understand, steady, unwavering, quiet as stone. He thought he had stripped me of dignity, but in that instant I held on to something he could never touch, the knowledge of what I had endured, and the certainty that justice, though silent, always waits for its hour. And so I sat, motionless in the storm of whispers, every eye still fixed on me, the word servant hanging in the air like smoke. I said nothing, but inside, the fire had already begun to burn. It wasn't a joke. I knew Stephen's tone too well. That smirk wasn't mischief. It was cruelty dressed as charm. His voice carried that same coldness I had heard before, in the smaller moments when he thought no one was listening. He had a way of slipping knives between words, slicing dignity so thinly it could be mistaken for banter. To anyone else, his remark at the wedding might have seemed like a clumsy jest. But I knew better. This was no stumble of speech. It was a declaration, deliberate and sharpened with intent. He wanted to mark his territory, not just over Emily, but over me. In front of our entire family, our friends and strangers alike, he reduced me to a servant, not with hesitation but with pleasure. This was Stephen's way of planting a flag, claiming power, establishing himself as the master. And the room gave him exactly what he craved: silence. The silence of complicity, the silence of cowardice, the silence that allowed his words to hang in the air like poison. My chest ached as my eyes turned toward Emily. My daughter, my only child, my reason for every weary morning, every endless night. Surely she would step in, shield me, refuse to let such venom stain the air. I prayed for her to speak, to place her hand in mine, to say, "No, Stephen, you will not talk to my mother that way." But she didn't. Her eyes dropped, heavy and evasive, as though the floor had suddenly become fascinating. Her smile, once radiant, had already faltered into a nervous line. And in that instant, the silence between us became louder than Stephen's insult. It was the silence of betrayal, not loud or final, but sharp enough to pierce. I felt the weight of that silence settle into my chest, crushing and cold. My heart did not just ache, it clenched. The hatred that rose inside me was not only for Stephen and his arrogance, but for what I could see unfolding, his grip tightening on Emily, his shadow stretching across the very bond I had spent decades building with her. Because I recognized the tactic. This wasn't merely about humiliating me. It was about driving a wedge. By belittling me publicly, Stephen was sending Emily a message. Your mother is beneath you. You must choose where your loyalty lies. It was subtle and vicious, the kind of cruelty that doesn't explode but seeps, and Emily in her lowered gaze was already showing cracks. Memories flickered through me like shards of glass. I thought of the nights I had sat at the kitchen table, counting coins to see if we could afford her textbooks. I thought of how I had sewn her prom dress myself, because the store-bought one was too expensive, pricking my fingers raw but smiling through the pain, because she twirled in it like a princess. I thought of her first heartbreak, when I held her as she cried, whispering that she was worth more than any boy who couldn't see her value. And now here she was, standing beside a man who treated me, the woman who had given her everything, as though I were disposable. My sacrifices had built the platform for her happiness, and yet in this moment I was the one being lowered, humiliated, dismissed. Hatred spread through me, not wild and chaotic, but cold and methodical. It was the kind of hatred that sharpens, not dulls. I hated Stephen for his arrogance, his need to assert control by grinding me under his heel. I hated the way his smile curved with satisfaction, as if my silence confirmed his victory. But more than that, I hated the idea that he might succeed in twisting Emily's love away from me, bending her loyalty until she looked at me not as her mother, but as an inconvenience. That thought was unbearable. I glanced around the room and saw the way people looked at me, some with pity, some with discomfort, others with smug curiosity. Their eyes slid over me as if waiting for a reaction, waiting to see whether the old woman would crumble. But I stayed still, swallowing every tremor, forcing my back straight. They would not see me beg for dignity. Not tonight. And in that restraint, the hatred settled deeper, rooting itself inside me. Hatred not as wild rage, but as fuel, steady and potent. Stephen thought he had silenced me, stripped me of power with a single sentence. But the truth was, his words had given me something else entirely: clarity. For years, I had endured whispered insults, small dismissals, the arrogance of younger men who believed age made a woman irrelevant. I had brushed them off, told myself patience was strength. But this? To be degraded in front of my daughter, to watch her lower her eyes rather than raise her voice, this planted something darker, something sharper, something that would not be ignored. Hatred, yes, but not hatred that eats away. Hatred that hardens resolve. Hatred that waits, watches, calculates. I sat there in silence, my hands clasped tight in my lap, my face still as stone. Inside, though, the seeds had been planted. Seeds of defiance, seeds of vengeance. Stephen thought he was writing the story of dominance, but he had just written the first line of another story altogether, one where his arrogance would not stand unchallenged. And as the music rose again, awkward and forced, as laughter stuttered back into existence, I knew one thing with a certainty that chilled me even as it steadied me. I would never forgive this night. The celebration went on around me as though nothing had happened, but for me, the night had changed. Music drifted faintly from the band, people laughed too loudly, and the clinking of champagne glasses struck my ears like hammers. Every sound seemed exaggerated, hollow, cruel. Each toast, each burst of cheer, felt like mockery. A celebration built on my humiliation. I sat rigid in my chair, eyes fixed on the tablecloth as though studying its folds could steady my trembling hands. But I could feel it, eyes darting toward me, lingering just long enough to pierce. Relatives with half-hidden smirks of pity, strangers pretending not to stare while whispering behind raised hands. Their words, though hushed, crawled into my ears. Did you hear what he said? The poor woman. Imagine being called a servant by your son-in-law, and in front of everyone. I wanted to scream, to shout, to rise and demand silence, but instead I pressed my hands flat against the table, grounding myself. Rage, like molten iron, coursed through me, hotter with every heartbeat. Did Stephen think I was powerless? Was it because of the wrinkles on my face, the gray streaks in my hair, the bent curve of my back that bore the weight of 68 years? Did he truly believe age stripped me of worth, that the passing of time had reduced me to something disposable? He mistook patience for weakness, humility for surrender. He looked at me and saw fragility, but he forgot the battles I had already fought and survived. Memories rose unbidden, sharper than knives. I remembered nights when I worked double shifts at the diner, coming home with aching feet, peeling off shoes that had worn thin from years of labor, only to start sewing clothes for Emily before dawn. I remembered walking past storefronts with dresses I could never afford, while clutching Emily's hand tighter, promising her that one day she would have everything I couldn't give. I remembered the hunger that gnawed at me when I skipped meals so she could eat, the cold winters when I patched old coats rather than buy new ones, the humiliation of cleaning strangers' houses and hearing them call me just the help. And yet through it all I had endured, not for myself, but for Emily. Every blister, every tear, every weary morning belonged to her future. I had raised her from nothing and placed her on a path toward everything. I had given her not just food and shelter, but my youth, my health, my dreams. And this man, this Stephen, thought he could erase all of it with a smirk and a sentence. He thought he could stand tall in front of a room full of witnesses and reduce me to a caricature, a servant, an afterthought. He thought he could strip me of dignity I had earned with blood and sacrifice. The more I thought of it, the tighter my fists clenched under the table. My nails bit into my palms, but I didn't loosen my grip. Anger roared in me, but it was not the kind that flared and vanished. No, this was anger that hardened, layered itself, grew stronger with every slight replayed in my mind. Stephen thought I was small. He thought I was a shadow in the corner, a relic to be ignored. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't even imagine, was the truth. He didn't know the weight of the years I had carried. He didn't know the depths of my endurance. And above all, he didn't know what I had in my hands, literally. My fingertips brushed against the envelope resting quietly inside my purse. Plain, unremarkable, hidden among tissues and old receipts. No one else at that table knew what it contained, but I did, and the knowledge of it simmered beneath my rage like a secret flame. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was publicly branded a servant, while within reach I held something that proved the opposite. He saw an old woman, irrelevant and weak. But if he knew the truth, if he understood even for a moment what I carried, his smirk would vanish. The arrogance in his eyes would shatter. My anger swelled at the thought of it. Not just anger at his cruelty, but anger at his blindness. He thought this night belonged to him, that he had the power to rewrite my worth, but he had no idea he was standing on a foundation built by me. Around me, the celebration blurred on, laughter rising and falling like waves I no longer heard. My focus narrowed until only two figures remained, Stephen with his smug arrogance and Emily with her lowered eyes. Between them, I felt the invisible rope tightening, tugging her away from me. My jaw clenched. He wanted me to feel small, but my anger reminded me of something else. I had never been small. I had been the one holding everything together when it all could have collapsed. And now, as fury thickened my blood, I knew this moment wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. I sat motionless, fists tight, heart pounding, the envelope heavy in my thoughts. He thought he had silenced me. He thought he had won. But in truth, Stephen had awakened something inside me that had been dormant too long, a fire that would not die quietly. When it came time for the gifts, the room shifted into that familiar rhythm of ceremony, tables quieting, guests leaning forward, anticipation thick in the air. Boxes wrapped in gleaming paper, envelopes sealed with gold stickers, velvet bags tied with ribbons. They passed from hand to hand, each one presented with smiles and applause. Laughter rolled through the hall again, as if the earlier insult had been brushed aside, buried under the glitter of celebration. But for me, every sound was distant, muffled. My pulse throbbed in my ears, steady and deliberate, as if counting down to something inevitable. I rose from my chair. The scrape of my chair legs against the polished floor was soft, but in my mind it sounded like thunder. Dozens of heads turned. The motion of my body alone seemed to hush the nearest tables. Guests fell silent not because they understood what was about to happen, but because they sensed something shifting. I felt their eyes settle on me. Sandra, 68 years old, gray in her hair, lines carved deep into her face by years of labor. They expected perhaps a blessing, perhaps a shaky smile as I handed over a card stuffed with bills. They thought they knew their role in this play, to watch an old woman offer her last treasures with trembling hands. But my steps were measured, not trembling. My spine was straight. My face revealed nothing. I walked forward not as a guest offering tribute, but as a sovereign delivering judgment. In my hand was nothing glittering, nothing wrapped in silk or tied with ribbon, only a plain white envelope, creased slightly at the edges. Its simplicity was its disguise. No one noticed it when I first lifted it from my purse, but as I carried it across the hall, it seemed to glow with its own weight, demanding attention. When I reached the couple's table, Stephen looked up at me, that same smirk tugging at his lips. His arrogance hadn't dimmed in the slightest since his cruel remark. He saw only what he wanted to see. A tired old woman fulfilling her role, bending her head to give one last offering to the youth who believed they now ruled the stage. I extended my hand. He took the envelope with a show of nonchalance, raising his eyebrows as if already amused. He slipped a finger beneath the flap and tore it open with eagerness that bordered on greed. His grin widened, flashing white teeth. I could see the thought written across his face. Finally, something worthwhile from the servant. But then his eyes met the page inside. The grin faltered. His lips twitched, as though searching for a shape they could no longer form. His face, once smug with expectation, drained of color. He blinked rapidly, scanning the words again, as though hoping he had misread them. The bravado melted like wax under fire, leaving behind something rawer, weaker, confusion first, then panic. Emily leaned in, curious, peering over his shoulder. Her cheeks blanched as soon as she saw. Her hand shot to her mouth, fingers trembling against her lips. For a moment, the two of them were frozen. In clutching the paper as if it might vanish, her staring with wide, horrified eyes. The silence in the hall thickened, heavy, electric. Guests craned their necks, some whispering, others waiting. They didn't yet know what was written there, but they could feel it in the air. This was no ordinary gift. It wasn't money. It wasn't a blessing. It was the deed to the house they had been living in. The house Stephen bragged about to his friends, claiming it as his own. The house where Emily had started her new married life, believing it was her husband's security, his foundation. But the truth sat now in his shaking hands, undeniable and merciless. That house had never been his. It had always been mine. My name, etched into the paper, signed and sealed long before he entered our lives. The revelation was silent, yet it thundered through the hall louder than any toast or speech. In one instant, the balance of power shifted. The smirk was gone, stripped away, leaving Stephen exposed, trembling beneath the weight of a truth he could neither deny nor spin. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was sharper than words, more cutting than any insult I could have spoken. It left him to flounder in his own arrogance, to feel the ground shift beneath his feet as every pair of eyes in that hall turned not toward me, but toward him, the man who had mocked me as a servant, only to discover he lived under my roof by my grace. My hands folded neatly in front of me. My breathing was steady. Outwardly, I was composed, calm, even gentle. But inside, the fire that had been simmering since his cruel toast roared in satisfaction. For the first time that night, I no longer felt small. I no longer felt the sting of whispers or the weight of pity. I stood taller, not by posture, but by truth. And in that moment, I saw something else in the faces around me. No longer pity, no longer whispers of humiliation, but curiosity, awe, even admiration. They knew, though I had not spoken a word, that what Stephen held in his trembling hand was not just a piece of paper. It was the answer to his arrogance, the undoing of his cruelty, the weapon I had carried quietly in my purse while he laughed at me. The plain white envelope, so ordinary, so unassuming, had become my voice, and it spoke louder than I ever could. Gasps filled the room as I finally broke my silence. My voice was calm, steady, but it carried through the hall like the toll of a bell. "You thought I was your servant," I said, my eyes fixed on Stephen, each word weighed and deliberate. "In truth, I am your landlord. Every brick of that house you brag about, every wall you lean against, every roof tile that has kept you warm, it was bought with my sweat. And now—" I paused, letting the silence grow sharp enough to sting. "It is no longer yours." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread instantly through the crowd. Whispers erupted, sharp intakes of breath punctuated the air. Chairs creaked as guests leaned forward, eyes wide, drawn as though pulled by gravity itself. The sound wasn't chaos. It was hunger, a collective need to witness what would come next. Stephen's arrogance collapsed in an instant. His face drained of color, the smugness stripped bare, leaving only shock and disbelief. His lips parted, but no sound came. The man who had moments ago reveled in humiliating me now stared at the paper in his hands as if it had turned into a blade aimed at his chest. Emily's reaction cut even deeper. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as she looked between me and her husband. Realization dawned in her expression, realization of truths she had never thought to ask about, sacrifices she had never considered, and the foundation of her marriage built not on Stephen's strength, but on my endurance. The guests leaned forward, necks craning, their curiosity a living thing. They were hungry for every word, eager to see the story behind the envelope unfold. I could feel their energy pressing in around me, their whispers swelling and breaking, their judgment already hanging over Stephen like a storm cloud. I let the silence hold for a moment longer, savoring its weight. Then I continued. "I had planned to gift you the house tonight," I said, my voice still measured, almost mournful. "It was to be my blessing, a symbol of love for Emily, and yes, even for you, Stephen. I wanted to give you both a foundation, a home secured by my labor and sacrifice. I carried that envelope here with pride, thinking tonight would be about joy, about family, about unity." I let my words hang in the air, letting each syllable sink like a nail into wood. Stephen shifted in his chair, unable to meet my gaze, his fingers trembling as he gripped the deed, crumpling its edges. "But after your words tonight," I said, sharpening my tone, "you have lost that privilege." The room exhaled collectively, a sound almost physical in its force. Gasps again, some sharp, some drawn out in disbelief. A few guests muttered openly now, their whispers no longer meant to be private. I caught fragments. "Unbelievable. Can you imagine? The nerve of him." I did not look at them. My gaze stayed fixed on Stephen, pinning him where he sat. The silence between us now was not weakness. It was power. And the words I had chosen carved through the illusion he had tried to build, leaving him exposed before everyone who mattered. Emily's tears spilled freely now, rolling down her cheeks as she clutched her chest. She looked not just at her husband, but at herself, her choices, her blindness. In her eyes I saw confusion, guilt, and a dawning comprehension that the life she thought she had built with Stephen had been propped up by me all along. The guests sat in rapt attention. They weren't simply bystanders anymore. They were witnesses to a reckoning. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing against Stephen, their judgment burning hotter than any words I could have spoken. For so long he had thrived on spectacle, using public humiliation to elevate himself. But tonight, the spectacle belonged to me. My voice had turned the hall into a courtroom, the envelope into evidence, and my words into a verdict that no one could ignore. Stephen tried to gather himself, his jaw tightening, his chest rising as though he might speak. But when he looked up, his eyes met mine and faltered. Whatever words he might have found shriveled before they reached his lips. He was a man suddenly stripped of his stage, a performer who had lost his lines in the middle of the play. And so I stood, calm and unyielding, the truth laid bare before them all. The house he had claimed, the foundation he had boasted of, the roof he had called his own. It had always belonged to me. Tonight was meant to be a gift, but now it had become a lesson he would never forget. Stephen tried to laugh. The sound, meant to be confident and dismissive, came out thin and jagged. His lips curled into something resembling a grin, but it wavered at the corners, betraying the unease he couldn't hide. He lifted the deed as though it were some trivial paper, waving it slightly in the air. "Ah, just a misunderstanding," he muttered, forcing a chuckle that died halfway through. His voice shook. His eyes darted nervously across the hall, searching for a sympathetic face, someone willing to join in the performance and safe from the weight of silence pressing down. But none came. The guests sat stiff, their stares sharp, their expressions unmasked. He leaned closer to Emily, whispering furiously, his words clipped and desperate. His hand reached for her arm, tugging at her elbow as if to pull her back into his corner, to salvage the illusion of unity. But Emily pulled away. Slowly, visibly, she stepped aside, the space between them widening like a crack in glass. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a trembling line, her tears still glistening. And for the first time that night, she stood near me. That single movement spoke louder than anything I could have said. The daughter he had tried to turn into his accomplice now shifted her loyalty, instinctively moving toward the woman who had raised her, who had carried her through every storm. The crowd saw it too. They noticed the separation. Whispers rippled through the hall, but now they weren't hushed. They carried freely, boldly, no longer afraid to be overheard. "Did you see that? She walked away from him. No wonder he was so smug. He never owned that house. Imagine humiliating his own mother-in-law like that, only to be exposed." The whispers grew sharper, more pointed, until they turned into open scorn. Laughter broke out here and there, not joyous but cruel, aimed directly at Stephen. What had begun as pity for me shifted into ridicule for him. His grand performance, his toast, his smug declaration, his attempt to cement dominance had flipped. The stage he had claimed for himself now became the scene of his downfall. Stephen's face flushed crimson, sweat beading at his temple. He tried to speak again, raising his voice, but the words tangled. It's not what it looks like," he stammered, but even he didn't believe himself. His voice cracked, and the guests only stared harder, some shaking their heads, others whispering with disgust. He had thought humiliation was a weapon, one he could wield against me. But in trying to shame me, he had stripped himself of respect, and now every eye in the room judged him, not as a proud groom, but as a petty, arrogant fool undone by his own cruelty. I didn't need to add a word. My silence, my stillness did all the work for me. Dignity radiated from composure, and composure was mine. I let him flounder, let him twist under the weight of his own arrogance. Emily turned her face away from him, her shoulders stiff with disappointment. The man she had married only hours ago stood diminished before her, reduced not by my hand, but by his own. And in that quiet rebellion, her small, firm step toward me, he lost the last ally he had hoped for. The laughter and whispers merged into something heavier, a collective rejection. Guests no longer pretended to hide their scorn. Some exchanged knowing looks, others leaned openly across tables to murmur their judgments. His attempt to rise had instead dragged him lower, leaving him exposed, stripped of pretense. I stood still for a moment longer, letting the weight of the room settle on him, letting him stew in the shame he had brewed for himself. Then, without a word, I turned. My steps were slow, steady, deliberate. The hush followed me as I walked back to my table, each stride a statement. I did not need applause. I did not need validation. My dignity was intact, sharper and stronger than ever. Behind me, Stephen remained seated, small beneath the brightness of the chandeliers, clutching the paper that had destroyed his pride. He looked less like a man and more like a boy caught in a lie, left to face the laughter of a room that had seen the truth. I sat down at my place again, spine straight, hands folded neatly before me. My silence now was not weakness. It was triumph. I had no need to gloat, no need to spit venom. He had already done the work of tearing himself apart. All I had done was reveal what was hidden. And so I let him sit there, drowning in the shame he had created, while I remained untouched, my head high, my dignity not just restored, but magnified. Later in the evening, after the music had faltered into half-hearted melodies and the champagne had lost its sparkle, Emily came to me. Her hands, once steady and graceful in their youth, now trembled as they clutched mine. Her eyes, those same eyes I had watched grow from a child's bright wonder into a woman's determination, were wet with tears. She whispered, her voice broken and raw, "Mom, I didn't know. Please forgive me." The sound of her plea pierced me deeper than Stephen's insult ever could. For all his cruelty, he was not my blood. But Emily, my Emily, was the one I had bowled and sacrificed for. To see her caught between shame and regret, to feel the desperate squeeze of her fingers on mine, tore at the fabric of my heart. I wanted to fold her into my arms and shield her from the man she had chosen, but I knew I couldn't. She had tied her future to him, and she would have to face the weight of that decision. My heart ached, not out of bitterness, but out of grief. Grief for the innocence she had lost, for the illusions she had carried into this marriage, and for the painful awakening that had arrived far too soon. Forgiveness. Of course I could forgive her, for lowering her eyes when she should have raised them, for standing silent when her husband mocked me. She was young, still blinded by love, still believing in promises whispered in the dark. But forgiveness could not undo the path she had chosen, nor could it shield her from the shadows that now lay upon it. I held her hands gently, my thumb brushing away her tears. I did not scold her. I did not remind her of all the nights I had stayed awake sewing her clothes, or the mornings I had gone hungry so she could eat. She already knew. Her tears told me so. What she needed was not a lecture, but the space to recognize the truth for herself. So I only said softly, "Emily, you have to see people for who they are, not who you hope they'll become." Her sobs grew, but I let them come. Pain was sometimes the only teacher strong enough to open our eyes. As for Stephen, he shrank into the corners of the room. The man who had stood tall and smirking only hours earlier now avoided every gaze, dodged every conversation. His laughter, once loud and arrogant, had been silenced. He sat hunched, nursing a drink he barely touched, his face pale and drawn. The master of the house, the man who had declared me a servant, had become nothing but a fool, pitied by some, ridiculed by others, despised by many. His pride had shattered so thoroughly that even his shadow seemed smaller. I saw him try to muster words, to gather allies, but none came to his side. Relatives who once clapped him on the back now turned away. Friends who had toasted him now whispered about his downfall. Even strangers who had barely known me shook their heads in disgust at his arrogance. Respect is a fragile currency, and he had squandered it all in one night. And me? I rose when the time came to leave, and I walked out with my head high. I was 68 years old, and though I had been humiliated, I had taken that humiliation and forged it into justice. Not with shouting, not with vengeance shouted from rooftops, but with silence, with patience, with one plain envelope that spoke louder than any words ever could. That night, I remembered every insult Stephen had ever thrown at me in hushed tones, every time he had looked at me as though I were a burden, every moment he had tried to push me into the shadows. And I realized none of it had ever truly touched me, because dignity does not come from how others see you. It comes from the life you have lived, the sacrifices you have made, the truth you carry inside. I left that hall not as a servant, not as a pitiful old woman, but as Sandra, a mother who had survived storms, who had raised a daughter on her own, who had built a home brick by brick with her hands. A woman who would never, no matter how sharp the insult, be stripped of her dignity. The night air outside was cool against my face, and I breathed it in deeply. Behind me, laughter and whispers still echoed faintly, but they no longer mattered. What mattered was the steady beat of my heart, strong and unbroken. I had faced humiliation and turned it back on the one who tried to give it to me. And in doing so, I had reminded not just Stephen, not just Emily, but the entire room of something they had forgotten. I was not weak. I was not small. I was not finished. With one silent envelope, I had restored justice, not just for myself, but for every mother who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or disrespected after giving everything she had. And as I walked into the night, I knew this: they would never forget my name. I was Sandra, and I would never, ever be a servant.